So this is Krista Whitney, and today is September 22nd, 2019. I'm here with Harold Bloom in New Haven, Connecticut. I'm going to record an interview as part of the Yiddish Book Center's Wexler Oral History Project. Do I have your permission to record? Great. So I'd like to just start talking with a bit of background. So, von wann stammt der Mishpacha?
Born July 11th, 1930. My mother, Paula Lev Levi, came from a little shtetl just outside of Brest-Litovsk. My father, William, came from Odessa and violently disliked it. They met on Orchard Street on the Lower East Side. He became, like so many in his generation, a dressmaker. She was a housewife. They had 5 children, of whom I was the last. They and my 4 siblings are long since gone.
Did they talk about Europe? Your parents, did they?
My father did not want to hear a word about Odessa or about Russians, whom he really despised.
Mm-hmm.
They did talk about the people they had left behind, parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, all of whom went down in the Shoah.
Do you have a sense of what life was like for your ancestors in Eastern Europe?
There are some photographs in the hallway there that you might want to look at. One is of my mother and her sister when they first came to the United States. Another is of my father. Another rather fascinating photograph is of his father, who's holding on very tight to a prayer book because being from, he's afraid that the picture is against the second commandment, against the Tzelem. Well, you know a lot about Odessa. It was a great Yiddish cultural center. Out of Odessa came Isaac Babel, came Jabotinsky, came all kinds of phenomena. As a very small child, 3, 4 years old, I was sent to Shalom Aleichem schools. You know those. Yeah, they were all over the Bronx. It's a pretty good early education, though it was strictly in Yiddish and Hebrew. And of course I went to Heder and Talmud Torah and learned Hebrew. But to this day my English is very curious because I learned it only through the eye and not through the ear. I was a preternaturally early reader, and at 5 or 6 I was already reading Shakespeare and trying to read Milton and so on. But English, of course, is a very peculiar language. As Bernard Shaw complained, the orthography and the pronunciation have nothing in common. So to this day I speak my own curious, inflected English. It doesn't sound like anybody else's, which is fine as far as I'm concerned. I still dream in Yiddish. when I'm talking to my mother in dreams.
So, do you know in the family history what the professions were?
Well, the proletarian on both sides, peasant people, but there were rabbis and Talmudical scholars on both sides. And even though the Lamarck notion of inherited characteristics is supposedly not valid, I go with it because even as a very small child, I had a shocking reading rate and an amazingly retentive memory. If anything I read, I could read 500 lines of poetry and then just repeat them. And in my early days, it slowed down. Now I could read about 1,000 pages an hour. Those have to be inheritances from Talmudical ancestors. And by now, of course, since I've studied a great deal of Talmud, I realize how much my way of teaching and writing what I call literary criticism is Talmudical to the highest degree.
So,
I didn't, in fact, hear English spoken until I was sent at the age of about 5.5 to public school 53 in the Bronx, where about half the children did speak English. I went to that awful place, the Bronx High School of Science, only because my brother and I were both terribly weary. On one side of us lived Italians. We got along with them. On the other side, past Southern Boulevard, lived the Irish. They were, a great many of them, in an organization called the Silver Shirts, headed by a Nazi Mamza named Joe McWilliams. After Pearl Harbor, he and a lot of them were put in jail because they were in fact paid by the Germans, by the Nazis. But I remember once I taught Rebecca Miller, Arthur's daughter, and one day when I was having dinner with the late Arthur, I had read an early novel by him, not a very good novel, about these terrible fights with the Irish hoodlums using baseball bats and broken bottles. That was my own experience and that of my brother. So I was very tired of that. So I went to a really dreadful high school, which I always disliked, called the Bronx High School of Science, even though I had no interest whatsoever in science. And I think I finished very near the bottom of my class there. But in those days, there was something called the New York Regents examination, which consisted of 1,000 multiple choice questions. I scored a perfect 1,000, which was no surprise because of what I'd read. And that got me a admission to and a fellowship to Cornell University. And from Cornell, which I liked, where my mentor was a wonderful man who died at the age of 103 a few years ago, Maya Howard Abrams, wonderful man. We became very close.
So can you say a bit more about your Jewish education?
Yeah. Jewish education? Well, the usual Talmud, Torah. I studied a fair amount of Talmud. The problem being that my mother was always incredibly frum, always surrounded by rabbis. But from bar mitzvah on, I found myself identifying with that splendid fellow who's always denounced in the Talmud, Elisha ben Abuya Acha. And I realized that my essential beliefs were Jewish Gnostic, something that I worked out much later during my friendships with Gershom Scholem and Hans Jonas and Moshe Idel, who still survives.
And what do you remember about the Sholem Aleichem Shulim?
I remember what we read. We read Peretz. We read, of course, Sholem Aleichem. We read the fundamental poets, including Bialik and Chernikovsky in Hebrew, and of course, the Yiddish poets who mattered most.
What did you think of the Yiddish literature back then?
Oh, well, I still think that it's a lot of the best poetry written in the United States is in Yiddish. And some of the best novels, not Bashevis, God knows, but his brother, who was a powerful novelist, called a Potter Show.
Did you have Yiddish books around in the home?
Oh, yes. Funnily enough, the first book I ever owned myself, and it still strikes me as hilarious, was a New Testament in Yiddish. One day the doorbell rang, and a missionary handed it to me. So I read it. Years later, since I became a classics major at Cornell, one semester with a marvelous scholar named Friedrich Solmsen, we spent a semester reading the New Testament in Koine. Even as a child, I conceived a virulent dislike of it, which I've made clear in many times, saying that indeed it should be called the Belated Testament and Tanakh, the original Testament, one of my many ways of making enemies, of whom God knows I have a plethora.
I know that you have quite a memory. I'm curious if any of the Yiddish poets hold some space in all of the literature that you have memorized. Did the Yiddish poets get in there?
Yes, Moshe Leib Halpern in particular is an amazing poet. The Yiddish Baudelaire, they called him, but he's not at all like Baudelaire. He is quite unique.
What do you admire about him, Halpern?
The humor, violently funny. And the mastery of the language. Unfortunately, he was dead before my time. I knew Klotstein pretty well. He was not as unlikable as Bashevis, but he wasn't a very sweet person.
Do you have particular poems of those two writers that
Oh, the wonderful one that of Moshe Leib Halpern that my friend John Hollander translated under the title of The Will, in which he leaves everything, including to the Polish king. And that wonderful poem about the birds, which is outrageous. But then I came here after graduation in the autumn of 1951. I looked around New Haven. I experienced my first week of Yale as it was in 1951. And I made a vow to myself that I would get my doctorate in record time in 3 years and get out of here and never look at the place again. But what happened was that from the moment I arrived here, you know, a Yiddish-speaking proletarian from the East Bronx, in a not exactly philo-Semitic English department as it was then, dominated by people who thought that T.S. Eliot was Christ's vicar upon earth. And I was not exactly a gentle, worn-out person as I am now. I was a little bit aggressive. So all the seminars I took, with rare exceptions, were very violent affairs, and they did their best here to get rid of me again and again and again, right to the time of the tenure vote on me. But I suppose the reason I'm still here is I got so angry at them that I just dug in and said I will fight it out and I will win. I won, all right. No, I'm not so sure it was a good idea to stay here, but going on 90 and still teaching, my 67th consecutive year of teaching, seems silly to say that. But in 1951, Yale was profoundly anti-Semitic. It, Harvard, and Princeton had a numerous clausus so that exactly 10% of each freshman class was Jewish, not 9.9 or 10.1, but 10%. And after I taught here a couple of years, I realized that I had taught only one student from the Bronx High School of Science, and he was Chinese. So, but all that has changed. It's ancient history.
I'm curious, when you were growing up or since then, if you were exposed to other forms of Yiddish culture. Did you ever go to the Yiddish theater?
Oh boy, I'm glad you brought that up. My three wonderful older sisters steadily took me to the Second Avenue Theater. Unfortunately, Tomaszewski and Jacob Adler were already gone, but Maurice Schwartz was there. The first Shakespeare plays I ever saw were in Yiddish at the Second Avenue Theater, and I will never forget my experience. I was thinking of that this morning because this coming Tuesday I have to teach the one Shakespearean play about which I am very equivocal indeed, The Merchant of Venice. So I was sitting with my three sisters in the Second Avenue Theater. This is about 1938, and I'm 8 years old. The magnificent Maurice Schwartz is Shylock. But this has all been marvelously rewritten in Yiddish. As they said, verbessert, improved. Schwartz was an enormous man. He had a gigantic black beard and a big booming voice. He played the histrionic old Russian style, like Jacob Adler and Tomaszewski. So there he is, waving an enormous scalpel, and he is approaching Antonio, the trembling Shagets, who is stripped to the waist. And suddenly, with a histrionic shudder that you could feel all through the Second Avenue Theater, Maurice Schwartz drops the scalpel and screams out, "Ich bin doch a Yid," which is, of course, untranslatable. I mean, it's like, well, after all, I am Jewish, and we don't do this sort of thing. At which the play stopped, and I got used to this at the Second Avenue Theater. Everybody in the audience cheered. Schwartz ran from one side of the stage to the other, interrupting the performance, bowing and throwing kisses to the women in the audience. Women dashed forward, throwing roses at him and so on. It became a sort of general tumult. It was 20 minutes before the play could resume. I loved it. And I saw him do an insane King Lear and so on. I also remember the Yiddish musicals I saw, including a wonderful one called Sei Freilich, with a marvelous, Molly Picon singing, but a marvelous comic. Now, what was his name?
Could it have been Skolnick?
What?
Menashe Skolnick?
Yes, Menashe Skolnick. I'll never forget at one point in Sei Freilich, somebody says to Menashe, "Why are you buttering your bread on both sides?" And Menashe replies in Yiddish, of course, "Do you think my lower teeth are orphans?" It was a wonderful musical. And had this marvelous villain, the Tante Barsheva. Oh, well, that was a long way back in time.
I'm curious, with your perspective, if you see Yiddish culture, some people say that it's sort of continued in other languages.
Oh, sure. I mean, Arthur, I never thought much of the death of a salesman until an actor with whom I was close, Joseph Bulow, translated into Yiddish and acted the part of Willy Loman. And he invited me to see it in New York. It was marvelous. The whole point is it works beautifully as a Yiddish tragedy, but makes no sense as an American tragedy. But in Yiddish, as rendered by Bulow and acted by Bulow, it had real power. And of course, I was a friend way back there of Zero Mostel. Marvelous fellow. I have not seen, and I'm not in any condition to go and see it, the Yiddish Fiddler on the Roof. I didn't much like it in English, but I gather it works in Yiddish. But I haven't seen a Yiddish play in a long time. But they're still being played steadily in New York. Yeah, it transmutes into other languages. It transmutes into American culture. And there is my friend who claims to be a disciple of Tony Kushner. I once told Tony Angels in America would be even more impressive in Yiddish. Meryl Streep was once my student here when she was in drama school, and I'm still very moved by it. I mean, I saw Angels in America in English twice. Marvelous performances by Ron Ribman, and a marvelous performance by my close friend, the actor F. Murray Abraham, who is, as you know, not Jewish. He's Syrian, but by now he's practically Jewish. He did the best Shylock I've ever seen on stage, except maybe for Marie Schwartz.
Do you have any sense of what, you've said Yiddish is untranslatable and sometimes things read better in Yiddish. Why is that?
It's because it's a familial language. It's intimate. It forms a circle and puts the world outside the circle. It's Mamaloshin. Somehow the language itself is full of a kind of maternal longing. I don't speak it very much here at Yale, sometimes with Peter Cole, sometimes with the composer Martin Bresnik, who, like me, grew up speaking it.
Do you like speaking it?
Yes, but here I am, almost 90. My mother died when she was 89, but that was a very long time ago, since I was the last of her 5 children, born when she was almost 40. My father died early at 73. The problem is it brings them back. And I'm too old to mourn.
Do you read Yiddish nowadays?
Of course. Well, mostly, of course. I read Greek or Latin or Italian or English. I don't teach any Yiddish works. I did some years ago, but not now. Now I just give courses in Shakespeare and in poetic influence, a subject I more or less invented.
So what Yiddish do you find yourself turning to?
Jabotinsky did a version of Dante. I've been writing about Dante recently and reading it in the Italian. And I looked at Jabotinsky's translation, which is very strange. Very strange man, Jabotinsky. But there's a sadness in all of it because I doubt that there's one Jew alive today in Odessa.
Do you remember, hearing about, were your parents in contact with family leading up to the war? Were you aware of what was going on?
Yeah, but then a great silence descended. And then even as a child, I became aware that all my relatives were being decimated. Well, it's all a long time ago.
Do you think Yiddish has an audience now, Yiddish literature?
Part of the problem is Israel. where I've spent various years teaching, there is still some Yiddish there. But I think there's actually more Russian than Yiddish. And Ivrit has crowded out everything. And everybody speaks English there anyway, so... No, the real problem now is that the only children, both in this country and in Israel, who grow up speaking Yiddish are the Haredim. With whom one has nothing in common. So the language survives only among people who really are contrary to its spirit.
Is it possible to describe the spirit of Yiddish culture?
Ironic. My favorite Yiddish proverb I translate, sleep faster, we need the pillows. That's the essence of it. Compassionate and conducting a kind of implicit quarrel with God. Remember the great statement of Benya Crick and Bob's great story, how it was done in Odessa? After his hoods have shot this highly meek and gentle Jewish clerk, the mother is complaining, and Benya says magnificently, all right, so I made a mistake. Even God makes mistakes. He could have put us in Switzerland, surrounded by nothing but thousands of lakes and millions of Frenchies. But where did he put us? Here in God-forsaken Russia. I must admit I'm getting tired. Let's have just a couple more questions.
Sure.
I tire easily.
No worries. I did want to ask you about where, sort of, as you've written about the Western canon and are so familiar with classics and, well, so much literature.
I majored in classics as a Cornell undergraduate.
Right. I'm curious where you see Yiddish literature fitting in or not with literature, with the Western canon.
Oh, it fits in. If you look at my catalog there, it includes a number of Yiddish works. The major poets, Chaim Gralla. And of course there are writers who don't write Yiddish, but who write German as if it's Yiddish. Kafka and Paul Celan. They're my late friends, Malamud and Phil Roth, who sometimes do that. I didn't get along with Saul, but he comes straight out of Yiddish. And Cynthia, with whom I get along very well now. Sometimes I feel Cynthia would be better off writing in Yiddish, though she doesn't write much these days. then, of course, there's the terrible case. If I had to be asked who is the most powerful writer yet to come out of American Jewry, it would not be anybody writing in Yiddish, and it wouldn't be Roth or the Henry Roth of Call It Sleep, which is practically a Yiddish novel. No, it would be that dreadful fellow, Nathan Weinstein, Nathaniel West, sort of Jewish anti-Semite. But Miss Lonely Hearts, A Coal Million, the final episodes of The Day of the Locust, are a kind of Yiddish literature gone mad, turned sour and powerful. Nathan Weinstein.
Well, before we end, I'm curious if there's anything that you would want people to know about Yiddish culture.
Well, the best thing to do is to read Uriel Weinrich and try to understand the extraordinary composition of the language, which is not at all Middle High German, but something completely new. Hebraic, Slavic, Germanic. In an odd way, it has the flexibility as a literary language of having antithetical forms in it, which is why English in particular, as Shakespeare demonstrates, has the extraordinary advantage that it has both a Germanic base and a Latin French base. But that's a much larger scale version. I'm pretty well burned out, honey.
Well, a großen Dank.
Okay. Yeah, I'm worn out.
Thank you so much for your
Nice
time.
to meet.
Nice to meet you.
Young ladies, thank you.